Charlie Kirk was stunned when this liberal made the most outrageous claim about Christianity.
All right, let's see it.
I'm particularly concerned about your brand of Christianity. As a Christian myself, Christian nationalism I do not agree with at all. I think it's antithetical to the values of the early church. And I think, how do you reconcile especially white Christians in this America, marrying politics and power with their faith in this country?
Well, there's a lot there. I've never described myself as a Christian nationalist, so I'm a Christian and a nationalist.
So launching into a Christian nationalist screed after saying you're not a Christian nationalist, you're just a Christian and a nationalist, is not very convincing. It just shows you're a Christian nationalist who, for whatever reason, doesn't like the label Christian nationalist.
So I've never used those two.
And then right there, that and nationalist, where in the scriptures does a Christian...
Well, thank you. Jeremiah 29:7, demand the welfare of the nation that you are in because your welfare is tied to your nation's welfare.
So that is absolutely not what Jeremiah 29:7 says, and this is an awful argument because Jeremiah 29:7 is addressing a specific set of circumstances and is not generalizable to any peoples in any nation in any circumstance. This is about the exilees in Babylon who, as we see in chapters 27 and 28, are expecting an immediate return to Jerusalem and are seeking their peace or their own welfare in returning immediately from exile. And what Jeremiah says is, get comfy, you're going to be there 70 years. That was God's prophecy. That's going to be fulfilled. So we have this letter in Jeremiah 29 being sent to the exilees, and it starts in verse 4, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile." Seek is the verbal root darash. It does not mean demand. Welfare is the noun shalom or peace. Ir means city. It does not mean nation. Where I have sent you into exile. That's the verbal root gala, which usually means to uncover, but can also mean to send into exile. And here it is in the causative stem, the hifil stem. I have caused you to be sent into exile. And pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare or peace, shalom, you will find your welfare or peace. Shalom. So in other words, this is telling the Judean exilees, you're not going to find your peace in an immediate return to Jerusalem. That's not going to happen. Get comfy in Babylon. This is not generalizable to all peoples in all nations, in all circumstances, in all times. And it does not say to demand. It does not say to grab the levers of power. It says to seek the peace of the city of Babylon because you're going to be there for a while. This is not at all a general defense of Christian nationalism.
Let me continue. Daniel fasted and prayed for his nation. Esther and Mordecai cared for their nation. They were counsel of the king.
Right.
Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Joseph, Jacob. I can keep on going.
So these are all Hebrew Bible figures who are seeking the survival of their ethnic identity in the face of persecution and oppression. This is ethnic insularity as a means of survival. This has absolutely nothing to do with the most privileged and powerful classes within the most privileged and powerful nation on earth grabbing the levers of power and saying, I want my way. This is entirely unrelated to what Christian nationalism is seeking, and these figures in no way, shape, or form whatsoever authorize, validate, or rationalize Christian nationalism.
Moses, Aaron. In fact, Moses was so political that he wrote an entire book of the Torah all about how to set up a government. It's the book of Deuteronomy.
No, the book of Deuteronomy was not written by Moses, who was likely not a historical figure, but even if he was, would have been long gone centuries before the book of Deuteronomy began to be compiled under the reign of King Josiah toward the end of the 7th century BCE as a part of his campaign to centralize cultic and political power in one city under one priesthood in the name of one God, but it would take several generations for the different constituent parts of the book to come together into what we now know as the book of Deuteronomy, which has nothing to do with how to set up a government.
So, in fact, the Bible is an explicitly political text amongst many other things.
Which is not relevant to the actual concern that was expressed.
Now, can we interpret those texts in the light of the revelation of Christ? Because you just cited all Old Testament texts, but you've not once cited St. Paul.
Okay, yeah. If you want me to also, by the way, just so we are,
cite St. Paul about the kingdom of heaven and the governments.
Just so we're clear, do you think that the New Testament is greater than the Old Testament?
It is. It is greater because the revelation of Christ dictates how we interpret the Old Testament.
So you think that all of a sudden, like Genesis 1 is not as great just because of the New Testament?
The Old Testament was a type and shadow of the things to come, and now we live in the full revelation of Christ.
Yeah, that is by definition such a dangerous theological...
That's not true. That's Christological theology.
Hold on. Of course I believe in the resurrection. But to all of a sudden say that, like, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is, like, somehow lesser because of the revelation of the New Testament.
So here's where Kirk's cherry-picking forces him into a disingenuous and a hypocritical argument, where he's got to deny what this speaker is actually claiming and pretend that he's arguing something else. Because the speaker rightly points out that Kirk interprets the Hebrew Bible through the lens of the New Testament, through a Christological lens. And Kirk is saying, no, it's not less than appealing to Genesis 1. But Kirk very clearly reads Genesis 1 through a Christological lens. Ask Kirk what "let us make man in our likeness and according to our image" means. He's going to interpret it through a Christological lens. That's the Trinity. Jesus is present in the creation that is described in Genesis 1. Of course he reads the Hebrew Bible through a Christological lens. However, because his defense of Christian nationalism appeals exclusively to the ethnocentrism and the ethnic insularity of these authors who are fighting for the survival of an oppressed small group, he has to deny that the New Testament's prioritization of universalism over and directly against ethnocentrism ought to be the priority. He has to pretend that's not the case at all. He can't directly address it, so he just has to make this ludicrous case that Genesis 1 stands on its own, independent of the New Testament, and is not less than, even though he will very clearly read Genesis 1 through a Christological interpretive lens.
Christ even said, "I did not come to abolish the law of the prophets, I came to fulfill the law." In fact, he said all the laws of the prophet hang on the two teachings, Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 3 through 5.
So here Kirk's argument gets more ridiculous. He's got to defend the notion that the Hebrew Bible is not to be interpreted through the New Testament by appealing to the New Testament's interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. But it's even worse than that because he appeals only to the Gospel of Matthew, which is a Judaizing gospel, which asserts that the law of Moses remains in effect, which Kirk would vehemently deny. But additionally, the Gospel of Matthew insists that Jesus' authority is greater than that of the Hebrew Bible, because Jesus says, "You have heard that it was written in the law, do this, but I say to you, do this other thing," which amplifies the law. It says this is still in effect, but you actually have to live a higher law. In other words, it's the New Testament reinterpreting the Hebrew Bible in an authoritative way, at least for Christians. Now, Kirk is not aware of all the complexities of the Judaizing nature of the Gospel of Matthew, and he doesn't really know what he's talking about, but he's shooting his own argument in the foot here.
However, to use a New Testament example, as you asked, it says in 1 Timothy, "Pray for your leaders in authority by name that they might make righteous and great decisions."
And this has nothing to do with Christian nationalism and is not advocacy for taking over the government or leveraging the power of the state to force others to comply with your worldview.
I'm going to continue. Christ our Lord said, "On this rock build my" what?
Church.
Wrong. Ecclesia. It's not the word church.
Okay,
the word
English
church,
translations of Common Bible say church, so my bad.
Well, actually, it shouldn't, because the original Greek term says, "On this rock build my government structure." Ecclesia was a secular word used in that time.
So this is wildly misinformed, and there are a couple of things I want to point out. The first is that the New Testament is not using ecclesia according to this notion of a regularly summoned body of citizens who come together to craft legislation. not only is that a technical use that is not manifested anywhere in the New Testament, but that would be something approximating a pure democracy, which Charlie Kirk really doesn't like. So it's definitely not that. And overwhelmingly, pretty much all scholars are in widespread agreement that ecclesia is being used in the New Testament according to one of the other very common uses, to refer to a gathering of like-minded people, a congregation or a community of believers. It's beginning to take on the sense, by the time the Gospel of Matthew is written, of a church, or at least a congregation. But what it is manifestly not is this thing that Charlie Kirk hates, namely a pure democracy where all the citizens are summoned together in order to craft and pass legislation.
Which was all about the advancement of freedom and liberty, which are the two words in Greek, eleutheria and isonomia, which are the two words there.
So I know the word eleftheria, and that can be translated freedom or liberty. I don't know what other word he's trying to say. Sonomia or psonomia, those aren't words in Greek. They're certainly not the words that are translated liberty or freedom anywhere in the Greek New Testament. And also I don't know what he means by the two words there. They're not in Matthew 16:18. So unless he's just pointing out that the Greek New Testament has words for liberty or freedom, I have no idea what point he's trying to make here.
So the point being, Christ called us to be salt and light. We as Christians should change the environment that we come in contact with. That's what salt and light do. So why should we then not care about changing government to be more Christ-like?
So the salt and light metaphors in the Sermon on the Mount are about your example influencing others. It is not advocating for appropriating state coercive power so that you can implement Christian rule. That is absolutely not a part of what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount.
Well, you're conflating changing government to be more Christ-like with what I was discussing was nationalistic endeavors, which is the inherent view that our nation is better than other nations.
Well, it is.
Well, God shows no partiality. So
well, no, that's not true. God says in Revelation, I will judge the nations. God says that...
The nations means ethnicity groups.
Well,
it doesn't mean borders of countries established.
Not necessarily. Hold on.
So this is an absolutely laughable argument on the part of Kirk. The fact that the book of Revelation says God will judge the nations does not mean that God loves the United States of America more than any other contemporary geopolitical unit. The word that is translated nations in the book of Revelation is ethne, which is the plural of the singular ethnos, which would be ethnic group, which is why it is combined with tongues, tribes, peoples. These are designations that do not align with contemporary geopolitical divisions. And so what they talk about as nations in the book of Revelation does not square with contemporary concepts of a nation. So Kirk doesn't have a clue what he's talking about here.
It does.
God says the Constitution of Israel will come at the end of the age.
There is no reference whatsoever to the Constitution of the State of Israel anywhere in the Bible.
Borders is biblical. The entire book of Nehemiah is about building a wall around the nation of Israel.
No, it is about the reconstitution and the survival of an ethnic identity, and the wall is symbolic of the integrity of that ethnic identity. And as this speaker has already pointed out, these are Hebrew Bible stories that are concerned with the survival of this ethnic identity in the face of persecution and oppression on the part of larger empires, something that the New Testament tries to do away with. It is universalizing salvation. It is universalizing God's favor.
In fact, the idea of borders, the idea of sovereignty is an explicitly biblical idea.
Yes, but Israel is no longer defined by the physical borders. It's actually defined in the spiritual sons and daughters of God who believe in Jesus.
That's a Catholic interpretation.
That's not just Catholic.
Again, it's primarily a Catholic interpretation. I don't share it. I don't want to get into that theological debate.
Okay.
That is absolutely not a Catholic interpretation. There are multiple places in the New Testament where membership in the house of Israel is quite explicitly recast as a question not of ethnic descent, but as a question of belief.
American history, slavery. Majority of white Christians supported the institution of slavery. Move on to Jim Crow.
That's actually not true.
No, that is true. That is true.
Time out. 9 out of 13 of the states, by the time of the ratification of the Constitution, were already abolishing slavery.
So as near as I can tell, this is entirely false. From what I can gather, only Massachusetts and Vermont, which was not yet a state in 1789, had formally abolished slavery in their constitutions. And for Vermont, it was just adult slavery. Men could no longer be held as slaves once they reached the age of 21. Women could no longer be held as slaves once they reached the age of 18. 4 other states were in some stage of a process of gradual abolition in 1789, and then the 8 other states had taken no formal steps towards abolition by 1789. So that's a minority of states. But additionally, even in the states where slavery was abolished, it wasn't all of the citizens, or even necessarily a majority of the citizens, who opposed slavery. And even in those states where slavery was abolished, people still purchased goods that were generated or produced in states that approved of slavery and by enslaved peoples. So the benefits of slavery were still enjoyed throughout the United States. And additionally, it was primarily Congregationalists and Quakers who pushed the abolitionist movement, and they represented maybe 20 to 25% of all the Christians in the United States. They were a majority of the population in those states in New England where slavery was being abolished, however. And so the largest factor in Christian opposition to slavery was a minority population of Christians, primarily some Congregationalists and most Quakers. So I think the data best support the conclusion that the majority of Christians in 1789 at the founding of the United States still supported slavery, and even those that don't still benefited from it and did not boycott, for instance, goods from states where slavery was legal or was still being practiced.
Let's move on to Jim Crow.
Well, time out. Slavery actually had a minority approval rating by the time of the U.S. founding. We were the second nation ever to abolish slavery.
So we were not the second nation. If we're talking about actual formally recognized nations, we were like 22nd on the list. Now, Vermont, which identified itself as an independent republic in 1777, again abolished adult slavery. And it would become a state, I believe, in 1791. So if you count Vermont as a nation, it was not recognized as a nation at the time, but if you count that, then Vermont would be first. Massachusetts would be the first state in the U.S. to abolish slavery in their constitution. But when it comes to the United States as a nation, that would take decades more, and we would not be even in the top 20 in terms of nations abolishing slavery.
Because of Christianity.
Certainly, Christianity was a primary driving force in the abolitionist movements, starting around the late 16th century CE, but this was in spite of the Bible, not because of the Bible, and it required a renegotiation of the Bible's position on slavery. And it was driven not by a biblical hermeneutic, but by personal experiences witnessing the horrors and the brutalities of slavery, combined with developing Enlightenment ideals about natural law and universal human rights and things like that, which compelled Congregationalists and Quakers to return to the Bible and try to find an opposition to slavery in the Bible, that renegotiation. So again, it was a product of other influences and then a renegotiation of the Bible.
Let's move on to Jim Crow, because majority...
You're moving on
because I didn't finish my statement.
But it was Christianity that abolished slavery.
So this is a laughably myopic and ignorant and hypocritical claim for a Christian nationalist to make in defense of Christian nationalism, given the abolition of slavery was the outcome of a minority of radically progressive Christians pushing back against the established Christian tradition and advocating for the rights of a minority over and against the power of the majority. In other words, everything that Christian nationalists today stand directly against and opposed to. Charlie Kirk, in the late 18th century, would have been a vehement supporter of slavery, but wants to leverage Christianity's role in the abolition of slavery to defend his belligerent right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation identity politics today, which again is laughably myopic and ignorant and hypocritical. And the fit for this video has been Miles Morales.